I wonder what would have been going on in Martha's mind as she went out to meet Jesus. Perhaps it might have been something along the lines like this. My brother is dead. He has lain in his tomb for 4 days, soul gone, lifeless body left, hope has departed. All I am left with is a shadow and a pain in my heart that will not go away. It is a pain that consumes me, a pain that is reflected in those around me and in my dear sister, Mary. People try to comfort me with the vague future hope that in the end times Lazarus will one day be resurrected, as all of us Jews will be. But what good is that to me now? For in this moment I am left with no brother. Where was Jesus? Where was he? I sent word to him several days ago that his dear friend Lazarus was ill, and yet he delayed. And by the time he got here, Lazarus, my brother, was dead. My friend Jesus, who has healed so many, who has performed so many miraculous signs, that remarkable man, and yet not remarkable enough to come soon enough to heal my brother. If only he'd come as soon as I'd sent word, if only he had not delayed. Even if he came a day after Lazarus's death, there may have been hope of his resurrection of his body. But now 4 days dead, there is no hope of that. His soul has gone. A rotting corpse is all that is left. If only Jesus had come sooner. If only. When was the last time that you had an if only moment? A moment like Martha here, who was replaying events in her mind in an attempt to change that devastating circumstance that she was faced with. These devastating circumstances that leave imprints on our lives, they lurk in the back of our minds and they get replayed over and over again in some vain attempt to see if it could have been any other way. If only we hadn't argued before he left that day. If only she had worked harder and passed her exams. If only he had never got in with the wrong crowd. If only we had seen the signs sooner. With the words, if only, comes a desire to turn the clocks back. It's a nostalgia for a life that could have been, moments that could have been had, daydreaming a different life that can lead into the realms of fantasy. And to keep dwelling in these things can lead to living a life in the past, a life living in hopelessness. For Martha, she had hope and an understanding of a future life, but this moment of devastation she was desperately clinging to, about what might have been. But then Jesus shows up and does what Jesus is best at doing, turning everything on its head. Jesus has finally arrived. I heard he was coming. I couldn't wait inside patiently like my sister. I had to run out and meet him. I needed to know where he had been, to ask him, but I also wanted to be with him, to be near him, to gain some closeness by his comfort. I couldn't help myself in blurting out to him that I thought he could have prevented my brother's death. But then I knew as soon as I had said it that I should have had faith in this Messiah. He tried to console me with the resurrection hope at the end of days that the prophets in the Jewish scriptures talk about, but I took little comfort from that. But then he said the strangest thing to me. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. He asked if I believed this. Believe this? But what does it mean? All I could say at that moment was what I knew to be true in my heart, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, who we were told was to come into the world. But what does it mean? Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Will there be hope for my brother sooner than expected? Can Jesus, the Son of God, the person who I am now told is the resurrection and the life, do something greater than I have ever seen before? And here, our story breaks off. We are left in suspense with the tantalizing thoughts of what might happen. Jesus has come in and turned the situation upside down and has moved Martha from her if only thoughts to focusing upon Jesus and daring to think, if Jesus. So where does that leave us with our if only thoughts? What happens if we begin to think, if Jesus? For Jesus has come from God's future, the future hope of resurrection to the here and now. He has broken into the mess and muddle of the world we know, so that hope is no longer a far-off distant promise, but it is here, now, for every one of us who believe in Jesus as the Son of God. The key to what Jesus does and says is the faith of the grieving woman, Martha. It is her faith that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised one, that led to Jesus doing something beyond her expectations. Her faith in him meant that Jesus could bring back into a lifeless body, bring life back into a lifeless body, and in doing so point towards the greatest ever miracle, the death and resurrection of his own body, so that those who believe may believe forever in God's kingdom. For where Jesus is, the resurrection is present and active. Life overcomes death. Of course, this does not mean that there will be no death or suffering for those who believe in Jesus. Lazarus, as we know, although Jesus raises him from the dead, does eventually die an earthly death. We who believe now will die in this life, but we will enter into eternal life to live eternally with our Father. This hope then of resurrection in the person of Jesus gives hope even in the most desperate of situations, even when hope seems dead. Jesus takes us beyond ourselves and leads us to himself. He tantalizes us and says, "Do you dare to believe in something greater than you can ever imagine?" Is there an if only in your own heart that you want to run to Jesus like Martha did and share it with him? To tell him your fears, disappointments, and desires of how you wanted it to be? Make some time, spend time telling Jesus about it, and in doing so, be prepared for a surprising response. I don't know what it will be, but Jesus promises to meet our problems with some new part of God's future that will burst into this present time, into the mess, into the grief, with good news, with hope, and with new possibilities.